The courthouse stood like a fortress at the edge of the city, its stone walls casting long shadows across the steps as people filed inside. The trial had already drawn significant public attention. Reporters crowded outside with cameras and notepads, their voices carrying in hurried whispers as they speculated about the outcome of what had been labeled one of the most disturbing cases the state had seen in years. Inside, the air was heavy, a kind of heaviness that didn't just hang, but pressed on everyone present. It was the first day of testimony, and the jury, 12 strangers chosen from different walks of life, sat uneasily in their seats. Each wore an expression of both curiosity and dread, knowing they were about to bear witness to something they could never unsee or unhear. The judge, a seasoned man with silver hair and a voice that could command silence with a single word, adjusted his glasses and glanced over the docket. He knew this case would test the very core of justice, not because of a lack of evidence, but because of the fragile witness about to step into the spotlight. Across the aisle, a defense attorney smirked confidently. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes darting to his client, the defendant, who sat motionless, his jaw tight, eyes narrowed. The man had been accused of crimes no one wanted to say aloud in public. Yet here he was, dressed neatly in a dark suit, trying to present himself as calm and composed. But his tapping foot betrayed him. The prosecution, however, wasn't smiling. The district attorney had spent weeks preparing for this day, combing through every piece of evidence, every testimony, every angle that could help the jury see the truth. And yet, he knew his strongest moment was still ahead, the introduction of the most unexpected witness the court had ever seen. The gallery was packed. Family members of the accused sat rigidly, refusing to make eye contact with the victim's supporters, who occupied the other half of the room. Reporters hunched over their laptops, their fingers hovering over keyboards, ready to capture every detail. Even the bailiff, a man who had sat through countless trials, looked more alert than usual, as if sensing something monumental was about to unfold. Then came the moment. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened slowly, and every head turned. A small child entered. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Her steps were hesitant, guided by the firm but gentle hand of a guardian who walked beside her. In her other hand, she clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted, and one eye missing. The toy dangled awkwardly, but to her, it was a shield against the stares of strangers. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some people frowned, confused. Others whispered, "A toddler? On the stand?" The judge raised his gavel lightly and tapped it once, silencing the murmurs. "Order," he said sternly, though his eyes softened when he looked at the child. The little girl was lifted carefully into the witness chair. It was far too large for her. Her legs dangled high above the ground, swinging nervously. She pressed the teddy bear against her chest and looked around. The courtroom, with its high ceilings, rows of stern faces, and echoes of shifting papers, must have felt like a giant's den to her. For a moment, she said nothing. The prosecution lawyer leaned forward, offering a reassuring smile. "Hello, sweetheart," he said gently, his tone far different from the sharp, commanding voice he used when addressing witnesses or questioning suspects. "Do you know why you're here today?" The child's lips trembled, but no sound came. Her wide eyes darted from the lawyer to the judge, then to the sea of strangers watching her. Some jurors exchanged skeptical glances. A toddler, they thought, couldn't possibly understand what was happening. One of them even shook his head subtly, as though already dismissing her credibility. The defense attorney smirked again, whispering something to his client. The man leaned back, more relaxed now. In his mind, this was a gift the prosecution's case was unraveling in real time. After all, What judge or jury would base a verdict on the words of a child who barely knew how to form sentences? But the prosecution held steady. He knew something the defense didn't, something that would silence every doubt in that room. The judge leaned forward, speaking directly to the girl. His voice was calm, deliberate, and unusually gentle. "Young lady, you are safe here. No one will hurt you. Do you understand?" The little girl blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears. She hugged her teddy tighter. Still, she didn't answer. The silence stretched. Reporters glanced at each other, already imagining tomorrow's headlines. Star witness fails to speak. The prosecutor's heart pounded, but he didn't panic. He looked toward the bailiff and gave a small nod. The bailiff moved to the side door, opened it, and another figure entered the room. It wasn't another lawyer, nor a detective. It was a dog. The sound of nails clicking against the polished wooden floor drew every eye in the courtroom. A German shepherd, muscular yet calm, padded confidently toward the front. His harness bore a gleaming badge, marking him as part of the K9 unit. His handler walked beside him, but the dog didn't need guidance. He knew where he was going. Gasps turned into whispers again. Some jurors sat up straighter, curious. Even the defense attorney's smug expression faltered for a split second. But the most dramatic reaction came from the toddler. Her eyes widened, and for the first time that morning, her lips parted. She loosened her grip on the teddy bear, dropping it onto her lap, forgotten. Her tiny hands gripped the arms of the chair as she leaned forward, fixated on the German shepherd. The room seemed to exhale collectively. The change in her demeanor was undeniable. The dog stopped in front of the witness stand, sitting tall and still, ears perked, eyes steady. He didn't bark or move. He simply waited. The toddler tilted her head, studying him. Slowly, her body relaxed. A fear that had paralyzed her, since entering the courtroom seemed to melt away in the presence of the dog. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He wasn't entirely sure what he was witnessing, but he knew it was significant. The prosecutor gave the faintest of smiles. This was exactly what he had hoped for. The courtroom had expected silence, failure, and disappointment from the child. Instead, what they witnessed was something extraordinary, the unspoken bond between a traumatized child and the dog who had once saved her. And though no one yet knew what words would leave her lips, the air buzzed with anticipation. For the first time, everyone realized this was not going to be an ordinary testimony. The tension in the courtroom only deepened after the German shepherd entered. The dog had settled himself near the front, sitting tall, ears forward, his calm presence filling the air with a strange kind of reassurance. But all eyes, once again, returned to the small child seated in the oversized witness chair. She was tiny compared to the grandeur of the courtroom, her legs dangling, her shoes swinging back and forth nervously without touching the ground. The teddy bear she had once clung to had slipped to her lap, but her gaze never left the dog. It was as though the animal's presence alone created an invisible shield around her. The jurors shifted in their seats, intrigued now in ways they hadn't been before. At first, most had dismissed her too young, too fragile, too unreliable. Yet something about the stillness of her posture, her wide eyes locked on the K9, suggested there was more to her presence than anyone had anticipated. The prosecution attorney took a slow step forward, crouching slightly so that his face was on her level. He had worked with child witnesses before, but this was different. This wasn't a teenager or even a 10-year-old. This was a toddler barely able to piece sentences together with clarity, and yet she was expected to play a part in unraveling a case that could decide a man's future. He smiled gently. "Sweetheart," he began softly, his voice stripped of all courtroom authority. "Do you remember me?" The little girl blinked, hesitated, and then gave the faintest nod. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. It wasn't much, but it was something. The prosecutor leaned forward just a little more. "Do you know why you're here today?" A question hung in the air. Everyone waited. The defendant leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips, confident she would stay silent. But the child didn't respond immediately. She fidgeted, her small fingers tracing the fabric of the witness chair. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't force the words out. The defense attorney rose quickly, seizing the opportunity. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "with all due respect, we are wasting this court's valuable time. This child clearly has no understanding of what is being asked of her. The jury cannot—" "Sit down, counselor," the judge interrupted firmly, his gavel tapping once. His eyes softened as he turned back toward the girl. "She will have her chance. Continue." The defense attorney gritted his teeth, but obeyed, though the smirk returned to his face. The prosecutor nodded, thankful for the judge's patience. He didn't ask again. Instead, he followed her eyes. She wasn't looking at him or the jury. Her gaze was fixed firmly on the German shepherd, the canine officer sitting so calmly at the front. It was then that he realized her words wouldn't come for him, not for the jury, not even for the judge. They would come for the dog. "Would you like to say hello?" The prosecutor asked softly, tilting his head toward the canine. The little girl's eyes flickered back to him briefly, then returned to the dog. She hesitated, her lips parting just slightly before closing again. The prosecutor gestured discreetly, and the handler gave a small nod. The canine rose smoothly, his nails clicking lightly on the polished floor as he approached the witness stand. The little girl gasped softly, her body leaning forward as the dog came closer. He stopped just a few feet away and sat down again, his tail curling neatly around his paws. The room held its breath. Her small hand slowly reached out, trembling, as if testing whether this moment was safe. Her guardian gave her a reassuring pat on the back. Encouraged, she let her fingers stretch outward. The dog didn't move at first. Then, with calm precision, he leaned just enough for her fingertips to brush against his fur. Her shoulders relaxed instantly. It was as if a wall of fear had crumbled in a single touch. Gasps spread across the courtroom again, but this time they were different, softer, emotional. Even some jurors couldn't help but exchange glances, their skepticism slowly eroding. The defense attorney looked less comfortable now, shifting in his seat as though unsure of how to counter a bond that needed no words. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression one of quiet fascination. He had presided over hundreds of cases, but he had never seen a moment quite like this. The prosecutor didn't rush her. He simply waited, letting the silence work in his favor. The dog's presence was doing what no legal strategy could achieve. It was giving the child courage. The girl whispered something, too faint for anyone to hear. The prosecutor leaned in gently. "Could you say that again, sweetheart?" "A little louder?" Her voice quivered, but grew clearer. "That's my dog." The room erupted in murmurs. The judge immediately silenced them with his gavel. The defense attorney stood again, trying to mask his unease with mockery. "Your Honor, this is nonsense. The child is confused. That canine belongs to the police department, not her. This is dangerous, allowing fantasy to replace fact." The judge shot him a glare so sharp that the defense attorney froze mid-sentence. "Sit down," the judge barked. The defense attorney obeyed reluctantly, his jaw tightening. The little girl's words hung in the air. Though technically inaccurate, they carried an undeniable weight. To her, this dog wasn't just a police animal, it was hers, because he had been the one to find her, to comfort her, to protect her when no one else could. The jury, once doubtful, now leaned forward in rapt attention. They weren't hearing polished legal arguments or rehearsed testimony. They were witnessing raw truth from the purest source imaginable. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, then back at the child. He didn't need her to explain the whole story. Not yet. The foundation had been laid. She had spoken, and more importantly, she had connected. "Thank you," he said gently, his voice carrying warmth. "You're very brave." The little girl gave the faintest smile before turning her attention back to the canine, who remained at her side like a sentinel. What had started as doubt and skepticism was now shifting. The jury, the gallery, even the judge could sense it. Something extraordinary was unfolding, something that went beyond the limits of procedure. The unexpected witness had spoken, and though her words were few, they carried more weight than anyone in the courtroom had anticipated. And for the first time, the defense began to realize that their carefully constructed case might not be strong enough to silence the truth of the child and her dog. The trial was far from over, but in that single moment, the balance had begun to tip. The moment the German Shepherd entered the courtroom, everything shifted. Until then, the air had been thick with doubt and skepticism. Jurors had leaned back in their chairs, exchanging glances that spoke louder than words. What can a toddler possibly add here? The defense attorney had smirked with confidence, convinced the prosecution had made a desperate mistake by calling such a young witness. Reporters had already started drafting their headlines in their minds. Child witness silent in court. But then the dog padded in, his nails clicking rhythmically against the polished wood floor, and silence fell like a blanket across the room. He was magnificent. His coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, a perfect blend of black and tan, his frame powerful yet disciplined. The badge on his harness caught the light with every step, marking him not as a pet, but as an officer of the law. His handler, dressed neatly in uniform, held the leash loosely, knowing this was not just a dog, this was a partner who knew his job well. The dog's amber eyes scanned the room with a calm, commanding presence. He didn't bark, didn't flinch, didn't even glance at the gallery filled with dozens of strangers. He walked with a purpose, as though he understood the weight of the moment. And then he stopped. Right in front of the witness stand, he sat down, his posture tall, his gaze steady. He didn't look at the judge or the jury. He looked only at her, the little girl. The child who had been silent, frozen, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. The moment their eyes met, something unexplainable happened. Her rigid posture softened, her trembling lips stilled. She leaned forward ever so slightly, her tiny fingers inching toward the edge of the chair. She had been terrified minutes ago. But now, she looked as though she had found something familiar in a sea of strangers. The jury noticed. They straightened in their seats, their expressions shifting from doubt to curiosity. Reporters stopped typing mid-sentence, their eyes darting from the child to the dog. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised, intrigued by the transformation. The defense attorney frowned, his smugness faltering for the first time. He tapped his pen nervously against the desk, whispering something to his client, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The prosecutor knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. He didn't rush. He let the silence breathe, let the connection between child and dog play out for everyone to see. The little girl's teddy bear slipped from her lap and landed softly on the floor. She didn't notice. Her entire attention was fixed on the German Shepherd, whose calm demeanor anchored her in a way no adult voice ever could. A handler gave a small signal, and the dog moved a step closer. Not too close, just enough that the girl could reach out if she wanted. And she did. Her hand trembled as it stretched forward, fingers splayed. For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. Then her fingertips brushed against the dog's fur, soft, warm, grounding. The effect was immediate. Her shoulders dropped, Her chest rose with a deep, steadying breath. The fear that had clouded her face since she entered. The courtroom melted away, replaced by something else. Trust. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Some jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the judge's stern expression softened as he watched. The child whispered something. Too quiet for anyone but the dog to hear. The prosecutor leaned closer. "Can you say that again, sweetheart? Just a little louder?" Her voice was fragile, but it carried this time. "Doggy." 2 syllables. That was all. Yet the courtroom reacted as though a bombshell had been dropped. Murmurs rose instantly, only to be silenced by the judge's gavel. The defense attorney shot up from his chair. "Your Honor," he barked, "this is highly irregular. We are allowing a child's babble to sway a courtroom? She is clearly just distracted by the animal. This has no bearing on the facts of this case." But his voice lacked the confidence it once carried, because everyone could see it, the shift. In the girl, the fear was gone. The silence was broken. The dog hadn't just entered the courtroom. He had unlocked the witness. The judge ignored the defense for the moment and turned to the child. His voice was gentle. "Do you like the dog?" The girl nodded, her eyes never leaving the shepherd. "What do you like about him?" the judge asked softly. She hesitated, then whispered again, "Good dog." The words hung in the air like a spark catching fire. The prosecutor's heart pounded. Those words weren't random. He remembered the police report. The night she had been found scared, hidden, silent, she had said those very same words. When the K9 discovered her, "Good dog," the officers had written it down because it was the only thing she said that night. Now, here in front of the jury, she was saying them again. And suddenly, the jurors weren't just watching a scared toddler. They were watching a survivor relive the moment of her rescue. The defense attorney sputtered, trying to regain control. "This is absurd." She's repeating words she's been coached to say. "This is manipulation." But his voice faltered under the weight of what everyone else could see. This wasn't coached. This wasn't rehearsed. This was instinct, memory, truth. The K9 officer remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on the child. He didn't wag his tail, didn't move closer. He simply sat, steady and strong, the embodiment of trust. The courtroom was no longer skeptical. It was captivated. And in that moment, everyone knew this dog wasn't just an accessory to the case. He was the key. The prosecutor gave the child a reassuring nod. He didn't need her to say more today. The foundation had been laid. The connection had been made. The jury had seen with their own eyes that the bond between child and dog was real, unshakable, and tied to the truth of what had happened. The little girl reached forward again, burying her small fingers in the shepherd's fur. She smiled for the first time since stepping into the courtroom. And as she did, the balance of the trial shifted. The unexpected witness had found her. Voice not in the words of adults, but in the presence of the K9 officer who had once saved her life. And though no verdict had yet been reached, it was clear this case would no longer be decided by cold arguments or rehearsed defenses. It would be decided by innocence, loyalty, and 2 simple words that had already begun to echo in every heart in that room. The little girl's eyes never left the German shepherd. Her body, which had been rigid and frozen since the moment she entered the courtroom, seemed to soften. For the first time since she had sat down in the oversized witness chair, she wasn't clutching her teddy bear or shrinking back against the guardian who had escorted her. Instead, she leaned forward, her small hands gripping the wooden armrests as if to anchor herself, her entire attention tethered to the K9. The courtroom, meanwhile, had gone utterly silent. The jurors sat forward in their chairs, eyes fixed on her. The defense attorney, once smug and confident, was now restless, tapping his pen against the desk in an agitated rhythm. The prosecution remained still, knowing that something far more powerful than any line of questioning was happening. In front of them, even the judge, who had presided over decades of trials, looked quietly intrigued, but no one dared speak. The girl inhaled shakily, her small chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. She wanted to say something. Everyone could see it in the way her lips trembled, in the way her fingers twitched nervously, but she didn't turn toward the lawyers. She didn't look at the judge. She wasn't speaking for them. Her entire world, in that moment, was the dog. The shepherd remained, perfectly still, his amber eyes locked on hers. His tail didn't wag, his ears didn't flick. He simply sat, patient and steady, radiating a calm that wrapped around her like a blanket. For a child who had faced unspeakable fear, his presence was more than comfort. It was permission. The prosecutor shifted carefully, crouching a little closer so his voice wouldn't startle her. "Do you want to talk to him?" he asked softly, tilting his head toward the K9. The girl blinked. Her lips parted, then closed again. For a moment, she looked like she might retreat back into silence. The defense attorney seized on it instantly. He rose to his feet, his voice sharp, breaking the fragile moment. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate. We cannot allow a dog to serve as a conduit for testimony. This child is clearly incapable of communicating directly with the court. This is nothing more than theatrics." "Sit down, counselor," the judge said firmly, his voice carrying enough weight to silence the entire room. "The child will proceed at her own pace." The defense attorney's jaw tightened as he sat back down, his irritation barely contained. But the momentary interruption had rattled the girl. She flinched, retreating slightly into her chair. The K9 responded. Immediately. Not with movement, not with noise, but with presence. He blinked once, slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, as if to remind her he was still there. She exhaled, long and shaky. Then, almost imperceptibly, her tiny hand slid forward across the wooden armrest. She stretched her fingers toward the dog again, this time bolder than before. Her fingertips brushed against his fur, and she let them linger there. Her breathing steadied. Her lips trembled again. This time sound escaped soft, fragile, barely above a whisper. Everyone leaned forward, straining to hear. But the words were too faint. The prosecutor leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Could you say that again, sweetheart? Just a little louder?" She swallowed, her gaze still fixed on the dog. Her tiny voice trembled but carried. "Good dog." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously, their keyboards clattering as they rushed to capture the moment. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, some of them visibly moved. The prosecutor's heart surged. He knew the weight of those two words. And the defense attorney paled, his earlier confidence evaporating before everyone's eyes. Because those words weren't random. The night the child had been found, hiding in fear, those had been the only words she spoke to the officers who rescued her. She had said them while clutching the fur of this very dog. The words had been written into the police report, preserved as the only piece of speech she had offered after the trauma. Now, in the middle of the courtroom, she had repeated them unprompted, uncoached, a spontaneous echo of the truth. The jury knew it. They could feel it. The defense attorney scrambled to recover. "Your Honor," he blurted, his voice cracking. With forced confidence, "this is meaningless. She's repeating something she was told to say. This is nothing more than suggestion. She's too young to know what she's saying." The judge raised a hand to silence him, but didn't address the objection immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the girl. He was watching her closely, not as a jurist, but as a human being. Her trembling, her innocence, her gaze locked firmly. On the shepherd, It all spoke louder than any attorney ever could. The girl repeated herself, louder this time. "Good dog." Tears welled in the eyes of several spectators in the gallery. The K9, still calm, shifted slightly and lay down, his body stretching out protectively near the stand. The girl smiled. Faintly, a small, fleeting thing, but the first smile anyone had seen on her since she entered the room. And in that moment, something unspoken passed through the courtroom. They weren't just watching testimony. They were witnessing memory. The little girl's silence had not been broken by fear or by manipulation. It had been broken by connection. The connection between a child and the animal that had rescued her from the darkest night of her life. The prosecutor looked at the judge. He didn't need to argue the point. Everyone in the room had seen it with their own eyes. The judge leaned forward, his voice softer than it had been all day. "You're doing very well, young lady. Very well indeed." The defense attorney sat stiffly, his hands gripping the table, his eyes flicking toward the jury. He could see it in their faces. The tide was turning, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The girl stroked the shepherd's fur again, whispering the words once more, as if they were the only words that mattered. "Good dog." And in those two words, the courtroom understood everything. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was heavy, filled with meaning, with truth, with the undeniable bond between innocence and loyalty. Everyone knew. The child was speaking not to the court, not to the lawyers, not even to the judge. She was speaking to the only one who had ever made her feel safe. And her silence had finally given way to a voice that could not be ignored. The courtroom was still recovering from the shock of the little girl's first words. "Good dog." Two simple syllables had shattered the silence and carried a weight heavier than any witness testimony so far. But no one knew that what came next would be even more powerful, because the child was far from finished. She sat quietly for a moment, her hand resting on the German shepherd's back. The dog's fur was thick beneath her fingers, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone. She inhaled slowly, her breath shaky, but steadier than before. The jury leaned forward unconsciously, caught in the fragile thread of her courage. And then it happened. Her hand, small and delicate, slipped away from the shepherd and rose into the air. Slowly, deliberately, her arm extended outward. Her fingers so tiny, so innocent, pointed across the courtroom, straight at the K9 officer. The reaction was immediate. A ripple of confusion swept across the room. Jurors exchanged glances, unsure what she meant. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against notepads. Even the prosecutor froze, his heart hammering in his chest as he tried to interpret the child's intent. The defense attorney shot to his feet again, sensing an opportunity. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "We cannot allow a toddler to simply point at a dog and expect the jury to derive meaning from it. This is not testimony. This is playtime." The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Sit down, counselor. A court will decide what is meaningful." But the girl wasn't finished. Her arm trembled slightly under the weight of every eye in the room, yet she didn't lower it. She kept pointing at the shepherd, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. A prosecutor crouched near her again, his voice calm, almost fatherly. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "can you tell us what you mean? Why are you pointing at him?" The girl blinked. Her lips quivered as if words were trying to escape, but couldn't quite form. She glanced once more at the K9, who met her gaze with quiet patience. And then, with a soft but steady voice, she spoke. Find me." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed through the chamber, followed by murmurs, then absolute silence again. The defense attorney looked as though the floor had been ripped out from beneath him. He scrambled to stand, stammering, "Oh, objection," leading the witness. The child doesn't understand what she's saying, but his voice was drowned out by the impact of those three words. "He find me." The phrase was broken, childlike, but unmistakable. The jury understood. The judge understood. Everyone in that room understood. The child wasn't just pointing at the dog because she liked him. She was pointing because he was the one who had pulled her from the darkness the night she was discovered. He was the reason she was alive. The prosecutor, careful not to push too hard, asked softly, "Can you tell us when he found you?" The girl clutched her teddy bear tightly against her chest. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the defendant across the room. For the first time, her small body visibly recoiled, pressing back against the chair as if trying to escape his shadow. The jurors noticed. The gallery noticed. The defendant shifted uncomfortably under the weight of 100 stares. The shepherd's head tilted slightly, sensing her distress. His presence remained calm, reassuring. The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "In dark place, scared, good dog, he find me." The gallery collectively held its breath. The judge leaned forward, his face grave but softened by compassion. "You're doing very well," he said gently. "You're very brave." The defense attorney could no longer contain himself. He leapt up, nearly knocking his chair backward. "This is outrageous. This child's words are incoherent, unreliable, and completely inadmissible." His voice cracked with desperation. "This trial cannot proceed on the whims of a frightened toddler and a mutt." The word mutt struck like a slap across the room. The jurors flinched. The spectators hissed. Even the judge's expression hardened. The prosecutor rose to his feet, his voice sharp for the first time that day. "Objection, Your Honor. That dog is a decorated K-9 officer, and that child has just identified him as the one who rescued her. Her words are not incoherent, they're truth." The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough." His voice thundered through the chamber, silencing everyone. "Counselor, one more word like that, and you will be held in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" The defense attorney sank back into his chair, his face flushed, his confidence slipping through his fingers. The girl, meanwhile, lowered her finger but kept her eyes fixed on the shepherd. She seemed calmer now, as though pointing to him had unburdened her of something heavy. For weeks, she had carried the memory of that night in silence, too afraid to relive it. Now, with two small gestures, a word and a finger, she had told the truth more powerfully than any adult witness ever could. The jurors shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Some nodded faintly, as though a silent agreement was forming between them. The prosecutor smiled gently at the girl. "Thank you, sweetheart. You've helped us understand." She gave the faintest nod, her tiny hand returning to the shepherd's fur. Her body relaxed, the tension draining from her small frame. The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor, a reassuring rhythm that seemed to say, "You did it. You're safe now." The judge cleared his throat, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "This court has heard the child's words. The record will reflect her statement." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "And the court will take very seriously the meaning behind them." No one moved. The moment hung in the air, heavy with significance. The girl had not given a long testimony. She had not delivered pages of detail or dramatic accusations. But she didn't need to. Her finger had pointed. Her words had spoken. And the truth had found its way into the light. As the bailiff escorted her gently from the stand, the gallery remained hushed, almost reverent. Jurors watched her go, with expressions of quiet awe. Reporters whispered frantically into their recorders, knowing they had just witnessed the turning point of the trial. And the defendant? He sat frozen, beads of sweat forming on his brow. his earlier smirk erased, replaced with the dawning fear of a man who realized the truth had finally caught up to him. The girl disappeared through the side door, hands still clinging to the shepherd's fur as he padded beside her. The sound of the door closing echoed through the silent chamber. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then the judge leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. His voice, when it came, was low but thunderous in meaning. "This court has seen. Enough for today." And with that, the session was adjourned, leaving everyone in the room to grapple with the power of a single pointed finger and 3 small words that would change everything. The courtroom had never been so quiet. The judge's gavel had fallen minutes earlier, but the silence wasn't routine. It was the kind of silence that followed shock, after something so raw and undeniable had just been spoken that words seemed powerless to fill the air. The child's testimony, fragile yet unshakable, still lingered in everyone's minds. Good dog, simple, innocent. But now, combined with her pointing finger and whispered admission, those 2 words carried weight far heavier than anyone had anticipated. The K-9 officer sat near the witness stand, steady and calm, his body a fortress of loyalty. His amber eyes never left the girl as she was gently escorted from the courtroom, her small hand refusing to let go of his fur until the very last second. When the door shut behind them, it felt as though a chapter had closed, but everyone knew the trial itself was only beginning to unravel. The prosecutor remained standing, his hands resting firmly on the table. He didn't speak at first, giving the jury a chance to absorb what they had just witnessed. The defense attorney shuffled papers in a frenzy, desperate to find a hole in the child's words, though he knew deep down that nothing on those pages could undo what had been seen and heard. Finally, the prosecutor broke the silence. His voice was low, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, turning toward them slowly, "you just heard the only words this child has spoken since the night of her rescue. Not coached, not prompted, not rehearsed. Her memory is not clouded. Her voice is not manufactured. She remembered what none of us can forget, that on the night of terror, when all else failed her, one truth stood out. The dog found her." A murmur rippled across the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against notepads like thunder in the silence. The prosecutor continued, his words measured. "And in those 2 words, good dog, she reminded us that her rescue was real. That this case is not about theory, or suggestion, or what if. It is about fact. That dog did not walk into a dark room for a bedtime story. He was led there by training and instinct to find a child in danger. And what she has told you today is that she remembers. Clearly, unshakably, undeniably." The defense attorney shot up. "Objection!" He barked, sweat beading on his forehead. "Counsel is attempting to twist a child's simple words into grandstanding theatrics. This is emotional manipulation, not fact." The judge fixed him with a hard stare. "Overruled. Sit down, counselor." The defense attorney froze, then sank back into his chair, visibly rattled. The prosecutor turned back to the jury. "The defense would have you believe that 2 words don't matter. But tell me, what weighs more heavily on the scales of justice? A rehearsed alibi, or the unfiltered truth of a child too young to lie?" Her voice trembled. Yes. Her words were simple. Yes. But simplicity is the very reason they matter. She wasn't giving us a speech. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. The jury's eyes told the story. They were leaning in, hungry for the truth, shaken by the innocence they had just witnessed. Then came the moment that sealed the tension. The bailiff re-entered quietly, leading the canine back to his handler's side. The dog trotted confidently, but his eyes flicked toward the jury as though he understood the weight of what was unfolding. His presence alone was a reminder of loyalty, service, and truth. The prosecutor gestured toward him. That dog, Officer Rex, is more than an animal. He is an officer of this department. He has found missing children, tracked criminals, and saved lives. And now you've heard it, not from me, not from law enforcement, but from the very child we are here to protect that he found her. You cannot erase that truth. The defense attorney scrambled to his feet again. This is ridiculous, he thundered, his voice cracking under the strain. We cannot allow a case to hinge on a toddler's broken words and the theatrics of a dog wagging its tail. The jury must consider the law, not emotion. The judge's gavel struck once. You're on thin ice, counselor. Choose your words carefully. But the damage was already done. The jury's faces hardened at his outburst. His contempt for the child and the dog had bared itself like an open wound, and there was no bandage strong enough to cover it. The prosecutor let the silence linger just long enough for the jurors to absorb the contrast, the innocence of a child against the arrogance of a lawyer. Then he spoke again, his tone softer now, almost pleading. I ask you, members of the jury, to think about what you saw. Not just what you heard, but what you saw. The way she recoiled at the defendant's presence. The way her body eased when the shepherd was near. The way she broke her silence only for him. That was not performance. That was memory. That was truth. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions heavy with understanding. Some leaned back, arms folded, as though silently concluding that the truth was finally undeniable. The defense attorney, realizing he was losing, tried one last desperate move. He stood again, his voice sharp but desperate. Your Honor, I request a mistrial on the grounds of prejudice. This entire courtroom has been swayed by sentiment and theatrics. My client cannot get a fair hearing in this circus. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm but razor-sharp. Request denied. Sit down. The gavel struck again, echoing like a death knell across the chamber. The defendant slumped in his seat, his bravado gone. Sweat glistened at his temple. He tried to mask his fear, but the jury saw it. Everyone saw it. The prosecutor returned to his seat, confident. The little girl had done in 5 minutes what months of evidence had struggled to do. Her 2 words had pierced through every lie, every carefully crafted defense. They had reached the jury in a way no cross-examination ever could. The trial would continue. More witnesses would be called, evidence presented, arguments made. But everyone in that room knew that the case had shifted. The child's words had become the cornerstone. 2 words, simple, pure, undeniable, good dog. And those 2 words had done what no legal strategy could. They had reminded everyone, judge, jury, and public, that at the heart of this trial was not paperwork, not procedure, but a child whose life had been saved, whose innocence had been scarred, and whose truth had just broken free. When the gavel finally dismissed the court for the day, the gallery exhaled as though they had all been holding their breath. Spectators whispered, reporters dashed for the exits to file stories, and jurors filed out with haunted expressions. But one image remained burned into everyone's minds, the little girl pointing with her tiny finger, whispering her truth through 2 words that had shattered the defense. And as the K-9 officer was led out of the chamber, his tail swaying gently, the quiet realization spread through the courtroom. The truth had a voice, and it had spoken. The following morning, the courthouse buzzed like a hive. Reporters crowded the marble steps outside, their voices rising in a chorus of predictions. News vans lined the street, cameras rolling as anchors repeated the same line. Yesterday, a toddler's 2 words shook the courtroom, and possibly the entire case. Inside, the tension was palpable. Jurors filed in with weary expressions, but their eyes carried something different than before. Certainty. The prosecution knew. The defense sensed it. The balance of the trial had shifted, and everyone was waiting to see just how far it would tip. The defendant sat stiffly at the table, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting from the jury to his attorney. He tried to maintain his composure, but beads of sweat betrayed the turmoil beneath his carefully composed mask. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The gavel struck once, echoing across the chamber like a drumbeat. "Court is in session," he said. "Prosecution, you may call your next witness." The prosecutor rose smoothly, his voice confident but calm. "Your Honor, the state calls Detective Harris to the stand." A tall, broad-shouldered man in plain clothes stepped forward. His movements were steady, purposeful. This was the detective who had led the team that night. The man who had held the flashlight while Officer Rex, the K-9, followed the scent that led them to the child. As he took the oath and sat, the prosecutor wasted no time. "Detective Harris," he began, "please tell the court about the events of the night in question." Harris nodded. His voice was firm, the cadence of someone who had repeated the facts dozens of times, but still carried the memory heavily. "We received a call around 10:47 p.m. Officers arrived on scene within minutes. The area was dark, heavily wooded, with multiple abandoned structures. We knew time was critical. The child had already been missing for hours." The prosecutor stepped closer. "And what role did Officer Rex, our K-9 officer, play that evening?" Harris's eyes softened. He glanced toward the dog lying calmly beside his handler. "Everything. Rex picked up the scent from a small shoe we recovered near the trail. Within minutes, he pulled us toward one of the abandoned sheds. We found the child inside curled up, terrified, barely responsive. She didn't say a word, but she clung to Rex as if her life depended on it." Murmurs filled the courtroom. The jurors' faces were somber, some visibly moved by the imagery. A prosecutor nodded slowly. "Detective Harris, did the child say anything at all that night?" The detective hesitated for only a moment before replying. "Yes, 2 words. She whispered, 'Good dog.'" The jury collectively leaned back in their seats. The defense attorney closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. The prosecutor allowed the words to hang in the air before continuing. "And do those words match what we heard yesterday in this courtroom?" "They do," Harris said firmly. "Exactly the same. She said them to Rex the night we found her, and she said them again yesterday. That's not coincidence. That's memory." The prosecutor turned toward the jury, letting the gravity of the statement settle. Then he nodded. "No further questions." The defense attorney, clearly rattled, rose reluctantly. He adjusted his tie, fumbling for composure. "Detective Harris," he began, his tone sharp, "isn't it possible that the child simply repeated words she has heard others say about the dog? That she was mimicking, not testifying?" Harris fixed him with a steady gaze. "No, children in shock don't mimic. They cling to the one truth they recognize. That night, she didn't respond to me, or any other officer. Only to Rex. And her words were hers." The defense attorney's mouth opened, then closed again. He glanced at the jury, but their expressions offered no sympathy. They weren't buying it. With no further ground to stand on, he muttered, "No more questions," and sank back into his chair. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Your Honor, the state would like to introduce Exhibit 12. The bailiff handed a small recorder to the clerk. A button was pressed, and static filled the room before giving way to a faint but unmistakable sound, the trembling voice of a child. "Good dog." The courtroom froze. It was the original recording from the body camera of the officer who had been there that night. The child's tiny, fragile voice echoed through the chamber like a ghost. carrying the weight of truth that no cross-examination could erase. Jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes glistening. The gallery wiped away tears. Even the judges. Stern expression softened. The defense attorney shot to his feet again. Objection. Prejudicial? This is designed to manipulate emotions, not present evidence. The judge turned to him, his tone curt. Overruled. This is admissible evidence. Sit down. The defense attorney's face flushed deep red. He sank back into his seat, defeated. The prosecutor let the silence linger, then spoke softly. 2 words. That's all. No elaborate speech. No coached testimony. Just 2 words. And those 2 words match exactly what we heard yesterday. He turned to the jury. The truth doesn't need to be complicated. Sometimes it's as simple as a child pointing to the dog who saved her and saying, "Good dog." The jury's eyes told the story. They understood. They believed. As the detective stepped down, the prosecutor rested his hands on the table. His voice steady. The truth is unfolding, piece by piece. You've heard it from the child. You've heard it from the detective. You've heard it from the evidence itself. The child remembers. And no amount of denial can erase that. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, his pen tapping furiously against the table. He could feel the case slipping through his fingers, unraveling strand by strand. His client leaned toward him, whispering angrily, but the attorney's eyes betrayed his fear. There was no strategy strong enough to combat innocence. The judge called for a short recess, his gavel striking once. As the jurors filed out, their expressions grim and resolute, the gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters bolted for the doors, already composing headlines in their heads. But in the middle of the chaos, the shepherd lay calmly at his handlers. Side, head resting on his paws. His ears flicked slightly, but his eyes were steady. To him, this wasn't about headlines or verdicts. It was about the little girl he had found in the dark, the child who had called him a good dog. And, as far as he was concerned, the truth had already unfolded. The courtroom was unusually still that morning. The air carried a weight that pressed against every shoulder and tightened every chest. After days of testimony, after hours of emotional roller coasters, the jury was finally prepared to deliver their verdict. Outside, reporters buzzed and cameras flickered, but inside, all eyes were fixed on the little girl, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the witness stand, her wide eyes scanning the room. The German shepherd sat beside his handler, calm as ever, his amber eyes glinting with quiet intelligence. He was a silent guardian, an anchor of stability in a courtroom that had seen fear, confusion, and heartbreak. He had been there every step of the way, and now, somehow, the moment had come to seal the truth he had silently witnessed unfold. Judge cleared his throat, and the gavel struck with decisive authority. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, her hands trembling slightly, her voice firm but reverent. We have, Your Honor. The defendant shifted nervously in his seat, eyes darting toward his attorney, who gave a tight, anxious nod. The defense attorney's earlier bravado had long since evaporated, leaving only tension and desperation. The judge nodded. Please state the verdict. The foreperson inhaled deeply. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, and the shuffling of feet filled the air. Some jurors' eyes were wet, glistening with relief, others with solemn satisfaction. The child's mother let out a shaky sigh, brushing tears from her cheeks. Even the reporters paused, stunned, knowing they had just witnessed a verdict shaped not by rhetoric alone, but by the purest evidence of truth and courage. The voice and memory of a 3-year-old child. The defendant slumped forward in his chair, his face pale, his hands clenching into fists. He looked around desperately, as if searching for some unseen lifeline, some chance for escape, but there was none. The jury's decision was final, unequivocal, and undeniable. The judge's voice cut through the murmurs. The court thanks the jury for their service. The sentence will be determined in due course. The courtroom is adjourned. As the gavel fell, a wave of emotion swept through the chamber. People whispered, hugged, wiped tears from their eyes. But all attention remained on the little girl, whose courage and memory had anchored the case. She had been silent for so long, and yet, in her simplicity, she had spoken volumes. The German shepherd nudged her gently with his nose, sensing her anxiety as she struggled to process the verdict. She smiled faintly, and for the first time in days, she seemed completely at ease. The child's tiny hand reached up and rested on the dog's fur, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. Her mother stepped forward, kneeling beside her. "You were so brave," she whispered, wrapping her arms around the child. "Hey." Girl's small fingers clung to her mother, then to the shepherd, as if connecting the past and present in a single, unbroken moment. The handler patted the dog's side gently, his own eyes glistening. Officer Rex had performed perfectly. Not only had he found the child when she was lost, but he had also helped her find her voice in a place she had feared more than anything. A courtroom filled with strangers. Outside, cameras flashed as the child was escorted to the car. The crowd murmured their admiration for her bravery. She had been small, frightened, and vulnerable, and yet she had changed the course of the trial, with nothing more than 2 words and a pointing finger. Good dog. Months later, the story would dominate local news. Headlines would read, "Toddlers. Words bring justice. Canine officer plays crucial role in court verdict." Social media would erupt with admiration for both the child and Officer Rex, celebrating the bond that had altered the course of justice. The story wasn't just about a trial, it was about trust, memory, courage, and the quiet power of a connection no one could have predicted. For the child, the courtroom's tension faded into a distant memory. She never forgot the K-9 officer who had protected her, nor the moment she realized she could speak her truth safely. Her words had been small, but they had carried the weight of her experience, of her survival, and of justice finally being served out. And for Officer Rex, there were no headlines to read, no accolades to accept. His reward was simpler: a gentle pat on the head, a small hand resting in his fur, and the knowledge that the child he had found in darkness had now stepped into the light. The trial was over, the defendant convicted, and justice served. But the story lingered far beyond the walls of the courthouse. People talked not only about the verdict, but about the extraordinary bond between a child and a K-9 officer. They spoke about courage that transcended age, memory that survived fear, and the quiet, unshakable truth that sometimes justice comes in the form of 2 simple words. Good dog. In the end, the child's voice had carried farther than anyone could have imagined. The courtroom, once a place of tension and dread, became a stage for truth, innocence, and the silent heroism of a German shepherd who had saved a life. And when the doors closed that day, everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, proof that bravery and truth can come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the simplest words are the most powerful of all.